Hello there, my fellow myth and fantasy nerds. My name is Tanner, and I'd like to welcome you back to my YouTube channel. I know this video is a bit late. Things got a little crazy lately. Crazy in a good way, but crazy nonetheless. Also, yes, as a matter of fact, I am wearing a new sweater. I got it quite recently, and I think it looks, and to be perfectly honest, feels quite nice on me. Like, seriously, this thing is so soft. Anyway, this week's video will be part 3 of the Charles Dickens classic, A Christmas Carol. To recap, in last week's video, link up in the cards and in the description down below, Ebenezer Scrooge was visited by the ghost of Christmas past, who showed him memories of his rather rough school life, his apprenticeship under Mr. Fezziwig, and what happened after his fiancée broke it off with him and married someone else. So on that note, as always, please make sure to leave a like on this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe down below. Pretty please! It'll help me make more content for you. And without further ado, here is A Christmas Carol Part 3. Enjoy. Scrooge ended up snoring himself awake, and sat himself up in bed to gather his thoughts. He didn't need anyone to tell him that the clock was getting closer to 1 again. He felt he had woken himself up in the nick of time to be visited by the next spirit Jacob warned him about. Scrooge was suddenly struck by the chilling thought of which bed curtains the spirit might pull back when they came to visit, and, not wanting them ripped off their hangers, he opened them on all 4 sides, so as not to be surprised. Now that he was prepared for anything, Scrooge waited until the clock struck 1 once again. But nothing happened. 5 minutes went by, then 10, then 20, with Scrooge becoming more and more anxious as time went ticking by. Soon an entire hour passed, and when the clock struck 2, suddenly a stream of rosy red light appeared under the door to the next room. Even though it was only light, Scrooge's anxiety only grew, since he wasn't entirely sure what it meant, or where it was coming from. Soon enough, however, his curiosity overwhelmed his anxiety, and he put on his slippers and approached the door. "Come in, Scrooge," said a booming voice, as soon as his hand was on the doorknob. Scrooge opened the door, and was surprised by how much the room had changed. It practically looked like a small forest, with how much ivy, holly, and mistletoe was hung all around. The leaves were reflecting the light like little mirrors, and the berries of each plant twinkled like small jewels in the light of a roaring fire, the likes of which, Scrooge thought, that old hearth hadn't seen in his time, or Marley's time, or for heaven only knows how long. Piled up on the floor was an abundance of food and drink: turkey, chicken, ham, venison, sausages, pies, puddings, oyster barrels, freshly roasted chestnuts, bright red apples, juicy pears, exquisite oranges, fruit cakes, and bubbling bowls of punch, all piled up to form a throne of some sort, all filling the room with delicious steam. Relaxing on this rather unique throne was what appeared to be a cheerful giant of a person. In the hand of the giant was a torch, shaped kind of like a horn of plenty, and they held it aloft to shine its light on Scrooge as he peeked cautiously through the door. "Come in, and know me better, man," the giant boomed cheerfully, and Scrooge obeyed. He wasn't his usual stubborn self, however, and he hung his head, not looking into the giant's eyes, even though they shone with kindness. "I am the ghost of Christmas present," the spirit said. "Look at me." Scrooge did, admiring the spirit's appearance. He was dressed in a long green robe, which was bordered in white fur, and hung loose enough that his bare chest was exposed, as if saying, "I refuse to be covered up." His bare feet could also be seen, and his head was encircled by a wreath of holly leaves, with icicles hanging off here and there. His long, dark brown curls framed his cheerful face. His eyes sparkled warmly. His voice was cheerful, and his very presence had an air of joy that couldn't be hidden, and didn't even want to be hidden. Hanging from his belt was what appeared to be a scabbard, which was rusted and had no sword filling it. "I'm sure you've never seen anything like me before?" the spirit prompted Scrooge. "Never," Scrooge replied. "Never walked with any of my brothers or sisters?" the spirit asked. "Not that I know of," came the reply. "For the sake of curiosity, exactly how many siblings do you have, spirit?" "Over 1,800. Such a large family to provide for," Scrooge mumbled to himself. The spirit, as if he heard him, stood to his full height. Scrooge then spoke to the spirit in a humble manner. "Spirit, take me where you will. If you have anything to teach me, please let me benefit from it." The spirit smiled, and then said simply, "Touch my robe." Scrooge did as he was told, grabbing the robe and holding it tightly. Everything from the plants to the hearth to the throne made of food to even the dark of night disappeared, until Scrooge and the spirit were standing on the streets of London on Christmas morning. The weather was quite rough that day, and because of this, the people around the two figures were making a type of music, with the scraping of snow from their front sidewalks and roofs, where it dissolved into miniature snowstorms. The whiteness of the snow contrasted with the dark dirtiness of the houses, and there were deep ruts in the snow on the streets, made by wheels of carts and wagons. These ruts seemed to cross and recross each other, and they grew harder and harder to make out in the slush and the mud. The sky was dark and gloomy, and the snow covering the smaller streets and alleys was mixed with soot and dirt, as if every chimney in all of Great Britain caught fire at the same time, and was burning to their heart's content. There was nothing particularly jolly about the weather or the buildings, and yet there seemed to be an air of optimism that not even the heat of summer could spread. Everyone shoveling the snow seemed to be full of good cheer, calling to each other from their roofs and throwing the odd snowball. They would laugh enthusiastically whether someone dodged the snowball or if they got hit. All of the grocers' shops were open, and the displays were crafted to perfection. From baskets of chestnuts shaped like gentlemen's vests, to bunches of grapes hanging from hooks in such a way that turned people's heads as they walked past. Soon enough, church bells started ringing, signaling time for Christmas services, and people gathered in their Sunday best, their faces glowing with cheer. Scrooge also saw others making their way out of the stores and back to their homes, arms laden with food for their Christmas dinners. He also noticed as they walked past, the spirit would sprinkle what appeared to be incense from his torch onto their food. That was not the only thing that happened, however. Scrooge saw when someone started getting jostled around by all the others, and frustrated words were exchanged, The spirit had to merely sprinkle some incense on them, and Christmas cheer seemed to immediately take over. "It is very rude to argue on Christmas Day," the spirit said to Scrooge. Soon enough, the bells on the churches stopped ringing, and the grocers and bakers shut and locked their doors for the holidays. However, there was still a feeling of people working hard on their Christmas dinners, and you could definitely see it in the slightly melted patches of snow above where the ovens would be, and how the stones of the pavement were steaming and smoking, as if someone was cooking them as well. "Spirit," Scrooge asked, "that incense from your torch, is there a particular type of spice mixed in?" "My very own blend," came the answer. "Would it affect any kind of Christmas dinner?" "Any and all that are given with a good heart, especially to those meagre dinners of the less fortunate." "But why those especially? Well, they're the ones that need it the most." Scrooge thought about this for a moment, and then said, "I wonder, Spirit, why of all the beings in the world would you enjoy restricting others' harmless enjoyment of the season?" "Excuse me?" "It seems to me that you would strip people of their Sunday dinners, even though they're the only days when some of these families can eat. Am I right?" "I'm sorry?" "It seems to me like you strive to have these places closed on Sunday, and yet doesn't it all come to the same conclusion?" "I beg your pardon?" "Forgive me if I'm wrong, but it seems as though it at least has been done in your name, or perhaps your family's name." "Well, Scrooge," Christmas Present replied, "I will not deny that there are some on this mortal world who claim to know me and my family. They commit their deeds of anger, pride, selfishness, malice, resentment, jealousy, and discrimination in my family's name. Even though they claim to know us, we do not know them. To us, it's like they've never lived at all. Remember that, Scrooge, and put your blame on them, not on me or my family." Scrooge made this promise to the spirit, and they moved on, unseen by all except each other, through the streets and byways of the town. Scrooge noticed that, even though Christmas Present's stature was formidable to say the least, he could change his size to fit into any building he crossed the threshold of. Whether the building had vaulted ceilings or ceilings where Scrooge's head brushed against it, the spirit fit wherever he wanted. Soon enough, Scrooge and the spirit made their way over to a small house and sprinkled incense on the roof. Scrooge recognized the house as that of Bob Cratchit. When they entered, they found Mrs. Cratchit, dressed in a gown that, though patched and worn, was nevertheless draped in ribbons, which can be used to make something look presentable on a budget. She was laying the tablecloth with the help of her second eldest daughter, Belinda, who was also draped in ribbons. Peter Cratchit, the oldest son, was testing the potatoes for tenderness, while trying to keep the corners of his shirt collar out of his mouth. The shirt was a family heirloom, passed down from father to son for generations on Christmas. The two youngest Cratchit children came rushing in, screaming that they smelled the Christmas goose from the baker's, and immediately knew it was their dinner. They were now basking in the smell of sage, onion, and other spices and flavorings, while Peter stoked the fire to make sure the potatoes kept cooking. "Now, where is your father and Tim?" Mrs. Cratchit said. "And what about Martha? She wasn't this late last year." As soon as she said this, Martha, the eldest Cratchit child, walked in the door, and was immediately swarmed by her younger siblings. Mrs. Cratchit came walking over, and she took her daughter in a tight embrace, taking off her bonnet and her shawl, saying, "Oh, my dearest Martha, why are you so late?" "My apologies, mother," Martha replied, "but we had a lot of work to finish last night, and a lot to clear away this morning." Oh, never mind then, Mrs. Cratchit said. You're here now, and that's all that matters. Come, sit yourself by the fire. Now, where is your father and Tim? Father's coming, Belinda cried out. Hurry, Martha, hide, quick! Martha hid herself to surprise her father, and no sooner had her skirt whipped out of sight than Bob walked in the door, with at least 3 feet of scarf around his neck, and his clothes patched and brushed to look as presentable as possible. Tiny Tim was sitting on his father's shoulders, his legs in an iron frame, and a crutch held firmly in his hand. Why, where's Martha? Bob said as he looked around for his daughter. Oh, she's not coming, Mrs. Cratchit said, giggling slightly. Not coming? Bob asked, his cheerful demeanor slowly diminishing. He'd been looking forward to seeing his daughter again, and he carried Tim home all the way from church on his back, hoping to do so. Martha didn't want to see her father disappointed, because it was only a joke, so she walked out of her hiding place early and ran into the arms of her very surprised father. Meanwhile, the 2 youngest Cratchits took Tiny Tim out to see the Christmas pudding steaming cheerfully. So how was Tim in church? Mrs. Cratchit asked her husband, as she helped him remove his scarf. Oh, as good as gold and better, Bob replied. He sometimes has these reflective moments, and he thinks about the most peculiar things you've ever heard. When we were on our way home, he told me he hoped people saw him in church, because he was crippled. He hoped that seeing him would be a pleasant reminder to them who made lame men walk and blind men see. His voice started trembling more and more as he talked. He seems to be growing stronger and healthier every day. At that, the sound of a crutch quickly thumping on the floor could be heard, as Tiny Tim hobbled in as fast as his legs could carry him. Everyone went to work to get the table ready for dinner. Bob worked on making his famous punch. Peter and the 2 youngest Cratchits went to get the goose. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy, Belinda sweetened the applesauce, and once the goose was set at the table, Peter mashed the potatoes enthusiastically. Martha set the plates, and the 2 youngest got the chairs for everyone. Soon enough, everyone was seated, and the blessing over the food was said, and then the Cratchits' feast was under way. Once everyone had their fill of goose and mashed potato, stuffing and applesauce, and compliments on the dinner were exchanged, in came the Christmas pudding, filling the room with the delicious smell of spices and fruit. In the end, Bob filled everyone's cups with homemade punch, and then they all made a toast, with Bob leading with, "A Merry Christmas to all, my dears. God bless us." The rest of the family echoed this toast, and Tiny Tim, last of all, spoke up. God bless us, everyone. Tim sat close to his father, and Bob kept his small hand in his own, as if he wanted to keep Tim by his side and worried that his son might be taken from him at any moment. Spirit, Scrooge said, with a sudden concern he hadn't felt before this, tell me, will Tiny Tim live? The spirit looked at the corner, and then said softly, I see an empty chair over in the corner by the fire, and an abandoned crutch leaning against it. If these relics remain untouched in the future, then I am afraid the answer you're looking for is not a positive one. Scrooge sank to his knees and cried out, saying, Please, Spirit, say it isn't so. Please tell me Tim will be okay. If these shadows remain unchanged by the future, the spirit replied, no one other than another spirit will find him here. But so what? He continued. If he is going to die, he very well should. Heaven knows there's too many people walking around these days. Scrooge felt his heart sink as he heard his own words quoted to him by the spirit. He suddenly felt 2 things he hadn't felt in years: grief and shame. Scrooge, the spirit continued, Do not speak that phrase until you know how many too many is. Who are you to decide who lives and who dies? I do not know for certain, but in heaven you might be akin to an insect on a leaf, saying there are too many other insects feasting on his leaf. Scrooge hung his head in shame at the spirit's scolding. His eyes shot up again, however, as soon as he heard his name. "To Ebenezer Scrooge, the founder of our feast," Bob Cratchit said, lifting his cup in a toast. "The founder of our feast, indeed!" Mrs. Cratchit said, anger making her voice tremble and her face flush. "Oh, I wish he was here right now. If he was here, I'd certainly give him a piece of my mind, and I hope he'd be hungry for it." "Darling," Bob said to his wife, "it's Christmas. Think of the children." "I know it's Christmas, Robert," she replied. "It has to be, if we're drinking the health of such a greedy, repulsive, hard-hearted, cruel man such as him. You work with him. You know what he's like." "Dear," Bob said soothingly, "Christmas." Mrs. Cratchit sighed, and then said, "Oh, very well, for you and for the sake of the day, but not his. Long life to Mr. Scrooge, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. I'm sure he's very happy and very merry today." The children partook in this toast, with Tiny Tim finishing last once again. Scrooge noticed that, with the exception of Tim, their cheers seemed to have dimmed at this. Scrooge was akin to the boogeyman with this family, it seemed, and the mere mention of his name cast a gloom over them, which wasn't resolved for around 5 minutes. After it passed, it seemed as though their cheer had increased tenfold. Scrooge the Sinister was released from their minds, and they were all the better for it. Bob mentioned something to Peter about a job where he could earn £5 and 6 pence weekly, which, when calculating for inflation, is about £675 20 pence today, or for my American audience, $896.10. Soon enough, the jug was passed around, and they started singing Christmas songs together. Soon Christmas Present took Scrooge to see others celebrating Christmas in their own ways, from workers singing in the mines to sailors out on the open sea. Soon enough, Scrooge heard a very familiar laugh coming from the house Christmas Present led him to. If anyone had a laugh as contagious as Scrooge's nephew, Fred, believe me, I would like to get to know them. At this party, you could see Scrooge's niece-in-law laughing along with her husband and their guests. "He called Christmas a humbug of all things," Scrooge heard Fred say to his guests, "and I'm quite sure he believed it too." "And shame on him for it," his wife said. She was a pretty, young thing, with a dimpled face that seemed to have a permanent look of surprise on it. Her lips were plump, and seemed as if they were created solely to kiss and to be kissed. She had freckles all along her face that seemed to blend together when she laughed, and her eyes shined like the sun. "He's a funny old bugger," Fred said, "that's for sure. He's definitely not as friendly as he could be. However, I don't really have anything else bad to say about him. Believe you me, his misdeeds carry their own consequences." "He is very rich, dear," his wife prompted. "At least, that's what you've told me." "So what?" Fred replied. "His money's completely useless to him. He doesn't use it to do anything, good or bad. He doesn't even use it to make himself comfortable, let alone using it for us." He let out a chuckle at the thought. "I've got no tolerance for the man," Fred's wife said, and her sisters, as well as the other women in attendance, nodded and murmured in agreement. "Well, I do," Fred said. "I feel sorry for Uncle Scrooge. I couldn't be offended by him even if I wanted to. No one truly suffers by his conceitedness except for him. He deludes himself into hating us and doesn't join us for dinner. And what results from that? He doesn't miss out on much of a dinner. Well, I think he missed out on a good dinner indeed, his wife retorted. The other guests murmured their agreement, as they had finished eating dinner and were sitting around the fire while the dessert sat on the table. Well, then, I'm happy to hear you all enjoyed yourself, Fred said to them all. But all I'm saying is this. The only true repercussions of Uncle Scrooge not celebrating Christmas with us is that he loses the opportunity to create good memories with us. To be perfectly honest, the reason I invite him over every year is because I pity him. He may berate Christmas until he's 6 feet under, but I doubt he can be worse after I visit him every year in a good mood, saying to him, "Merry Christmas, Uncle Scrooge, how are you?" If it finally convinces him to give poor Bob Cratchit a raise at some point, at least that's something. This prompted peals of laughter from each of the guests, and soon the real fun began. As time went on, Scrooge just couldn't help himself. He would play along in each of the games they played, even though they couldn't see or hear him. Christmas Present seemed to enjoy this, and looked at Scrooge kindly as the latter begged him like a little kid to let him stay for longer. Soon the guests started playing a game called Yes or No. Fred had to think of something, and everyone had to figure out what it was by asking him yes or no questions. Soon enough, the answers were he was thinking of an animal, one that was still living, one that was rather unpleasant, one that was vicious, who grunted and growled sometimes and talked other times, who walked the streets of London, didn't live in a zoo, was never taken to market, and wasn't a horse, donkey, cow, bull, tiger, dog, pig, cat, or bear. Whenever a question was asked, Fred would be provoked into fits of giggling. "Wait," Fred's wife said, after a fresh burst of laughter. "I think I know. Is it Ebenezer Scrooge?" As a matter of fact, it was. Everyone laughed out loud and congratulated Fred on his choice, though some people argued that they thought "Is it a bear?" should have been a yes answer in this case. All right now, Fred said after the laughter died down. "I think Uncle Scrooge gave us enough laughs at his expense, and I think it would be completely unfair to not toast his health." Fred stood up and raised his glass. "To Uncle Scrooge, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, wherever he is." Everyone else repeated this toast, raising their glasses in turn. "Probably wouldn't care for it, but you can have it anyway," Fred said. As they partied into the night, Scrooge looked over and noticed that, even though his own appearance stayed as it was, Christmas Present seemed to have aged considerably as time went on. His hair had slowly turned from brown to gray to white, and his face grew more and more wrinkled as the day grew into night. "Are the lives of the spirits so short?" he asked. "My time here in this mortal realm is quite brief," came the reply. "I will leave you by midnight tonight. Now listen carefully, because I don't have much time." The clock started ringing that it was soon 11:45 p.m., and Scrooge noticed something under the spirit's robe. "Forgive me if I'm wrong," Scrooge asked the spirit, "but was that a claw poking out of your robe?" "It might be, because it still has skin and muscle," the spirit replied. "Take a look." He opened his robe, and Scrooge jumped back and yelped in shock and horror. There, crouching at the spirit's feet and clutching at his robes, were two children, a boy and a girl, hunched over, small, thin, pitiable, dreadful, dressed in rags, and acting more like animals than humans. Scrooge was about to say that they were perfectly lovely children, but his mouth and his voice wouldn't work, as if to say, what's the point in even lying to him? "Are they your children, Spirit?" Scrooge asked. "They are humankind's," came the reply. They stick to me as though they are unwanted. This boy, he continued, is named Ignorance, and the girl is named Want. Turn away from them and their kind, Scrooge, but especially Ignorance. On his face doom and death is written, unless the writing is destroyed. The spirit stretched out his hand and pointed it towards the city. You must reject this message. Reject it and reject those who proclaim it. If you accept these false sayings, you will make all things worse and submit yourself to the end. But, Spirit, Scrooge said, as the clock started chiming the hour, don't these children have a home or any wealth? Don't you still have prisons? The spirit asked pointedly. What about the poorhouses? Are they still up and running? Scrooge heard the clock strike 12, midnight, and as the last words of the spirit hung in the air, Scrooge looked around and saw he was alone. As the last stroke of midnight rang in the air, he remembered Marley's words, and turning his eyes ahead of him, he saw the third spirit approaching him gravely, like a shadow along the ground, wearing a dark cloak and hood. And there we have it. That was part 3 of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. How's that for a cliffhanger? If you liked this video and you want more, please consider leaving a like and subscribing down below so you don't miss any new content from me. Also, if you have any other ideas you want to see in any future videos, please leave your suggestions in the comments down below. Who knows? It might just happen. Alright, well, that's all the time I have for this video, so I'll see you all next week with A Christmas Carol Part 4. See you guys then.